意思，我想用英文报，然后我们到问问题的时间，你们可以用中文问，或是有其他的问题可以请问一下，问中文也可以。因为我觉得这个我现在是在田野的中间，所以我还没有办法想好，所以我觉得用中文报我会说比较少，就是用比较长的时间来说，所以用英文比较直接，可以比较直接跟你们讲。So this particular talk is based on some preliminary thoughts that are actually based on the interview section of my research. And so this is really based on the first phase of the research that I've been doing in Taiwan since June. And I've only just started the second part of my research, which is participant observation. That's in an LED company in Hsinchu. And that part is going to be much more ethnographic and much more participant observation based. So I'm really hoping that questions and discussion that come up today maybe can help me focus in a little bit better for that second part. I think this is a really good opportunity for me to get some feedback really early on. So the title of this talk is Secrecy, Knowledge, and the Value of Intangible Property. Preliminary Thoughts on the Anthropology of Patents in Taiwan's High Technology Industries. So I'm going to start off with an introduction to what intellectual property is and how anthropology has approached it in the past. Then I want to focus in on patents specifically. And I'm going to try to work some of the data I've collected in these interviews through the lens of two main approaches. One is an approach that looks at property in terms of communication, and the second is an approach that really focuses on the connections between knowledge and secrecy. So the anthropology of IP. So there are two main reasons commonly given for why we have IP, or what IP is. So the first one is a natural right, or a human right. It sees it as, I created this thing, or I gave birth to it, and therefore I have some sort of rights over it. I have an ownership right over it. And then the second one, and this is probably the more common one actually, is as part of a sort of grand economic bargain. So what do I mean by bargain? In this sense, I mean that this reasoning talks about intellectual property as being a means for promoting innovation. So the classic example of this is Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola's formula for its recipe is actually a trade secret. It's not patented. And as a result, nobody actually knows what its recipe is except for a few people within Coke. So the idea of the patent system in this bargain is that in return for revealing things that would have been secret, you reveal them to the public. In return, we'll give you a monopoly right on that product, on that patent for, say, 20 years. So this is supposed to be a give and a take. And it's supposed to promote innovation. Those are the key things. So while patents, copyrights, and trademarks all have their own relatively longer histories in particular places, they did not come to be thought of as a system that reached outside of those places until very recently, actually. It was only in the 1960s, with the founding of the World Intellectual Property Organization, that the term intellectual property, this specific term, first appeared as an umbrella term. So by umbrella term, I mean a rhetorical device that makes all of these different concepts come to be seen as a single thing, or a single category. And this has an important power to it. So the social sciences have actually been interested in IP also only very recently. Some of the early interest came from economics departments and involved economic modeling. And they focused on two main questions. The first is, why don't developing countries adopt IP? So why are there so many developing countries that just somehow refuse to adopt IP, or intellectual property systems? And then the second is, how and to what extent does intellectual property promote innovation? So while I'm not going to go into detail on these two, there's one thing that's worth noting, and that's that both approaches rely on an assumption that IP does promote innovation. They don't question that assumption. In general, they start with that and then work from there. Yet the problem is that we have no control case for making this claim. So we have intellectual property, we have a system, we can measure the amount of innovation that we have there, but we don't have a system, an alternative system, or an alternative case where there is no intellectual property system, where we could say, oh, there's more innovation or less innovation in this other case. And then the second reason that this is a problem is that there are actually plenty of examples where innovation is actually blocked by intellectual property or by patent rights. And that's especially clear in the LED example. So later approaches to intellectual property focus much more on political economic aspects or historical aspects. So out of this research, one of the things that we can get is that this economic reason of this bargain is just that. It's a justification for the system. It's not a reason why it came into being. The intellectual property system in general came into being because of political interest groups. And those interest groups are nation-based interest groups, like the music and movie associations in the United States, for instance. It's also nations themselves, so the United States is a great example. So, and then this system was created within nations and then spread internationally. And so part of that is through bilateral and multilateral pressure. Section 301 is a great example of the U.S., how the U.S. helps to force or attempts to force other developing countries to adopt a similar IP system as the U.S. has. So one result of this new trend in research is the ability to replace a culturalist argument that you see very often in newspapers with a structural theory of IP advocacy. So the culturalist argument, real quick, is the idea that certain cultures, like Chinese culture, just can't innovate. All they can do is copy. They just can't innovate. This is a kind of a culture of piracy sort of argument that's very similar to a culture of poverty argument that development anthropologists have been dealing with for a long time. And you can see this often in newspaper articles. Of course, it's very problematic. Historically, there's a lot of problems with it. But one of the things that this political economic approach has allowed is to talk about structural conditions that influence whether somebody advocates for IP or not. So for instance, the United States began its life as a pirate of British novels. And the British were very upset, calling the United States a pirate country. Of course now, as the United States gained its own store of IP, it began to advocate for much stronger rather than weaker protections. The same thing can be seen with Hollywood. Hollywood originally was in the East Coast of the United States and moved to the West Coast partly as a way of escaping Thomas Edison's patents on the film projector. Because California was比较乱. There wasn't much law at the time, and so Hollywood producers could go there and make their movies as they would like. The same thing happens with Disney and Mark Twain and multiple examples. So the Taiwan case is actually quite interesting here. And this is because even as Taiwan starts to build up its own store of IP, and therefore begins to have some sort of economic power, it still remains at the decidedly low end of political power. So it really has no way on its own to push for other countries or other places like China to adopt its own IP system. So it relies on other areas like the United States. So what then can anthropology offer to this? What do we get from it? So the first thing is that we can move from history. I think the historical interjection of political economy is very important, but anthropology can now add in practice. So what happens on the ground? So what are the consequences of structural power and its reproduction at a daily life level? So anthropology gives an approach not just about IP as normally defined, but also a broader approach that considers other aspects of knowledge and other kinds of control over it. So in turn, I think an understanding of IP gives an insight into the global division of labor in a Durkheimian sense or a Marxian sense, and into the connections between power and the movement of knowledge. And this is similar to questions raised by Foucault or Paterai or multiple other anthropologists. And then again, it goes into the nature of how